11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and an elderly lady is doing a spot of hill climbing on the Somerset-Devon border. This is the famous Whiteball summit, and 6024 is going well as she approaches the tunnel at the top of the climb. Ahead of her crews is a summer full of toil, along with sheer pleasure, as they sweep majestically along the shoreline. It'll be a battle to keep time on today's hostile, high-speed railway, and many of today's engine men weren't even alive when the art of operating these complicated machines on the main line died out. But between them, they're determined to keep this monarch on the march. It started badly. 6024 was at Bridgnorth with mechanical problems when she should have been at Bristol for the first train of the season. At the beginning of July, dogged by various mechanical problems, she was stuck at the engine sheds of the Severn Valley Railway. The Severn Valley's loco superintendent, John Price, climbed aboard to move her for the first time. It was an anxious moment. She'd just had a new axle box, and they were concerned that the bearing would run hot.
Well, unfortunately, although we try and treat it with the greatest tender loving care and do that, life is just like that, and something always tends to come and bite you on the backside. When we were moving the loco here, we had problems with what you might have heard the term a hot axle box on the tender. An axle box is the box that runs in between the frames carrying the axle and also houses the bearing that the axle runs in. What happened, the oil film must have broken down and allowed metal-to-metal contact between the axle and the white metal bearing, and unfortunately the white metal bearing got hot and, as we call, run, which melted the bearing. So unfortunately we had to stop and change that bearing. Once you've run a hot axle box, you can't run again until the axle has been ultrasonically tested that the heat hasn't caused any cracking. So unfortunately we had to pull out of that Torbay and change the bearing.
Her place was taken by the West Country class locomotive 34067, Tangmere. The question was, would Tangmere have to carry on substituting for the ailing King? "6024 backed off shed for some light exercise on Severn Valley trains. Don't be fooled by John Price's apparently laid-back manner. He moves in a split second to stop the engine slipping. Being a Great Western man from steam days, Mr. Price is the right person to nurse the engine back to health during the next 100 miles or so of gentle running. He started his career at Tyseley, that busy Birmingham shed where teenage lads would learn their trade on the tricky freight turns around the Black Country, usually on one of the Great Western's huge fleet of pannier tank engines. He could only admire the Kings from afar, although in later years he did fire them occasionally up Hatton Bank, a task not dissimilar to firing a pannier up the steep hill through Snow Hill Tunnel. And that's an experience that John Price can remember like yesterday.
One of the first sort of links you went into was the preparation link of locomotives. Then you progressed on to the sort of local freight jobs, and one of those was the Hockley Tripper, which was a tripping job from Borsley Junction to Hockley with the panniers, and it was monumental jobs because the panniers used to take out about a maximum load of 44 from Borsley, and to actually hear them snarling away and then heading towards Moore Street with the lever reverser right in the corner and the regulator wide open and just a solid column of fire going up the chimney. The noise, the sound, the smell, the adrenaline rush was absolutely tremendous, and pounding through Snow Hill Tunnel, and the sense of achievement when you've actually done this. But it was the character of the old drivers as well. They know how to get the best out of each individual engine, and it was a marvellous job, and if I could turn the clock back, I would go back there tomorrow.
Watch how smoothly a real engineman brings a train to a standstill.
You've got to feel a part of that engine. You can't be alien to it. That engine is the master. You are the controller of that piece of machinery. You've got to blend in with it. You've got to get the feel for it. And I always try to pride myself is that I would like to be a passenger in that train, and I wouldn't like to sit there with a bowl of soup that's going to crash down all over me due to mishandling of an engine. But I think people can appreciate that with any piece of machinery, if somebody's operating it right, it sounds a lot better. And something as grand and as expensive as the King, it's got to be respected.
At the end of the day, he hands King Edward I back to the engineers. This is a machine from that upstairs-downstairs age, when servants worked out of sight in appalling conditions. The machinery is heavy and it's awkward, with up to 22.5 tons resting on a single axle. Unsurprisingly, it's the white metal bearings they worry about. Before the King can run on the main line, she must pass an examination. An inspector will issue a kind of MOT that only lasts a day or two, though at least one onlooker is sure she'll pass with flying colours.
The engine felt right. She drifted along perfectly. The whole feel of the locomotive was absolutely splendid. She responded absolutely first class, and I feel that when she goes out on future rail tours there'll be no further problem with that engine. It's a credit to the lads of 6024, the work that's gone into the locomotive, and I just wish I could be out with that engine every single day. It would be a pleasure.
John Price's lifetime love affair with steam is something every old-fashioned railwayman can understand. Every one of them remembers life as an engine cleaner. Every one of them can recall that first foray from the shed, perhaps on board a little tank engine that was off to shunt the yard. And everyone remembers their first day as a fireman on one of the bigger engines, on a passenger turn perhaps, or a fitted freight. But the strongest memory of them all is of that very first day at the engine shed.
The thing that really struck me was when I came to work shifts as a young fireman and booking on at 3:30 in the morning, going down this shed, dark shed, with these locos. There must have been about 10 in the shed, and gas lamps. And of course, if water gets into gas, the lamp was going up and down. It was really creepy. You actually needed a flare lamp to go round, although we got gas lamps, you know. And then trying to prepare them underneath the smoke hoods and in the shed was quite a problem with trimming the coal, like. But yeah, I dare say we got used to it, and that was it.
Nowadays, Gareth is one of the traction inspectors who takes steam locomotives onto the main line. But half a century ago, this was the very first engine he ever cleaned, the Duke Dog 9017. His favourite engine then was the Great Western Manor.
Oh, I loved the Manors. I really didn't like the Manors, yes. I mean, they weren't good engines when I first started because the drafting wasn't as sharp as what they did. They altered the drafting on them and they were totally different locomotives.
He remembers setting out with a tender full of good Welsh coal on the Cambrian Coast Express.
The Welsh coal, it was all right with steam coal. But then you have to realise with Welsh steam coal, you have to fire early because it's slow burning and it expands as well. You've got the bank of 14 mile up to Lurdig in front of you, 1 in 51 at the steepest. And that was the art in keeping steam and water going up there. And you really felt well if you went over the top with 3 parts of a boiler and somewhere near the mark. Rolling into Shrewsbury with that camera in, with it quiet and just hearing the pump, just pumping back and forth and just rolling. And this engine, the Manor, 78 or 2 or 3, the 2 engines we had, were like Royal Train engines. The cleaners looked after it. They were just as if they come out of the museum. And Danny Rowlands, I remember the shed master at Aberystwyth, he used to paint the buffers white and the shackles and that. And I mean, you felt quite proud until you saw that old oak man back on the other end with this big king on the other end. I remember pulling up next to him one day and I said, by God, I said, fancy putting a thing like that on. We've done the work over the mountains and the inclines and everything. He says, don't you worry, friend, he said, they put another 6 coaches on at Wolverhampton.
Now it's Gareth who rides regularly with the king, and he's developed affection and respect for the engine.
She's a powerful engine, very powerful engine. She's quite demanding on the fireman, because I mean the length of that firebox, and a lot of them were frightened of her when she first came out, but I mean the more you do on them, the more you get used to it. But and everybody pulls your leg about being on the western region with the old man's tenders, whether you're shoveling off the floor and this, that and the other. But I think it's what you were brought up to, wasn't it, really?
Gareth was on the footplate in previous years. He's apprehensive about the engine heading the Torbay Express so soon after repairs, and with an extra carriage this year. In steam days, there'd have been more opportunity for running in. Gareth is the man who will have to deliver her to Bristol, bedding in the new bearing as best he can on a single trip.
It would have gone on local freight for a while and then worked yourself up to local passenger work for about 3 weeks, and then they'd go back on their booked work when everything was settled in and the engineers were happy with them, you know.
Does that put you under pressure? Not in a bad way, but at the back of your mind?
Yes, it's anxiety. You're just going to hope that it's going to perform all right to Bristol, and hopefully on the first express it does on the Sunday. We're rushing the job slightly, aren't we? I mean, she did 92 miles yesterday running, which was a good thing, and I think it's, you know, rubbed the rough edges off the bearings and that, so hopefully we should be all right. I found out from the engineers themselves what they've done to her and the problems they've had and what they've corrected. I know for a fact that we've got a bearing on the tender that I've got to keep my eye on. And then there's a few other things that they've changed. So I should be keeping a keen eye on that. I won't be working it too hard to start with. We will just trickle along and then assess the situation and then do a little bit further and go a bit faster until we get her up to about the speed we want her. Then I should like to do a decent speed with her before I end the day to make sure she's right for 75 mile an hour running on the Sunday on the Torbays.
The lads of the Severn Valley Railway have played a blinder in getting her ready, but there's only so much they can do. John Price's last job is to run her, complete with support coach, to the other end of the line at Kidderminster. So far the axles are all cool, though there's a niggling worry about one of the front bogie axle boxes, which seems a bit warm sometimes. A worry that's to return intermittently throughout the season. There's a main line connection at Kidderminster, and here, coincidentally, waits one of the King's successors, red-faced at being confronted with the monarch she tried unsuccessfully to usurp. As evening falls, John Price runs King Edward I gently onto the transfer siding that'll allow her to make a dawn departure from Kidderminster to Bristol. At first light, she reappears, propelling a strange little train onto network rail metals. The carriage will act as a mobile canteen, dormitory and workshop for the 6024 support crew. The water carrier, however unsightly, is a lifesaver, able to resupply the King's tender en route without them having to get in anyone's way with a water stop. It'll be left at Bristol rather than spoiling the appearance of the chocolate and cream rake of coaches that have been marshalled for this year's Torbay Express. At 5:45 in the morning, Gareth Jones and his EWS crew prepare for the 3-hour run to Bristol. The Bescot engineman, Frank Sutton, will be driving on the journey south. The Bristol driver, Paul Burns, will fire the King and be back in his home city by breakfast time.
Jimmy Tippin, they're flashing green and years ago, before the Eastern Atom. Yeah. But he was like this, wasn't he?
Old Kevin Truby, he was flashing yellow.
Yeah. A little bit of a blow here. Is the piston?
Gareth's immediately spotted a blow of steam from the front end. But the 6024 Society's engineer Hugh Button, riding on board with them, knows of the problem, and it's a minor one. 6024 gets into her stride through Worcester and Herefordshire before most people are awake on a Saturday morning.
The engine feels beautiful. She's running beautiful now. She's free and she's reacting properly. The beats are working. It's the best I've ever seen her running, actually.
What's this relationship, Gareth, between, on the one hand, the regulator and on the other hand, the reverser? It's a bit, for a driver of a car, it's quite confusing.
Yes, but it's basically the same as the car. It's driving in the gears on the car. This is the gears for this engine. So the only thing is we can bring it up in percentage. We can screw the coupling up to get. He's dropping it down again because we're climbing again. So he's using a bit more. He's doing it like a lot of drivers do, leaving the regulator where it is and using the reversing lever.
Is there a right and a wrong way?
No. It's the way the driver feels, how he likes to operate it. He's dropping it again, look. Basically, he's only got the regulator on first valve, and he doesn't want to open it on the large valve, which will cause quite exhaust on this engine. So he's working the reversing lever instead. But if he gets to a position where he's not getting the reaction from the reverser, he will then open the large valve on the regulator, and he'll have to adjust his valves accordingly. Yeah, he's dropping it down again. Frank, what position are you in now? 33%, which is good.
Is this an economical way of working, Gareth?
Yes.
And what's your preferred method? Do you adjust?
I would have done it the same as him. Rather than open this into the second valve, I mean, I'll get Frank to open the second valve. You can hear the noise.
Okay.
Frank, can you open the second valve so we can hear it? He's got to pull this one up because she can't open it. Now he'll drop it back. Now then. Hear the difference in the beat? More severe, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, Frank. Drop it back down, you want. Yeah, he's gone back into first valve again. You see the difference?
There was a lot of responsibility on your shoulders this morning. Did you feel that?
Yes, I apprehensive whether, you know, I mean, she'd do the job. I mean, when you think about it, she's got to go on an express tomorrow, 75 mile an hour. So if we didn't run her in properly this morning, she wouldn't have gone out tomorrow, you see. So we'll see when we get to Bristol. As we're going now, I think we're perfect.
West of Newport, having joined the South Wales main line and after a stop at Hereford to check around the axle boxes, the crew decide to open the King up a bit. Paul Burns builds a bigger fire but is careful to keep pressure below the red line. He'll try to keep the engine quiet during that long descent into the Severn Tunnel. Now King Edward I is doing 72 miles an hour and begins to feel more lively. The pressure is where the fireman wants her. He's left room for more water in the boiler, so can use the injectors in the tunnel if she begins to blow off. It's a daunting descent down the long incline. The tunnel mouth looks like nothing more than a rabbit hole in a grassy bank somewhere in the distance.
We're now just entering the mouth of the Severn Tunnel. Just over 4¼ mile long.
As expected, the King is starting to blow off steam, and Paul Burns turns on the water valve from the tender and then reaches up to open the steam pipe that will force water into the boiler. It's difficult to describe the feeling on the footplate. The hiss of steam, the sulphurous smell of smoke, and nothing to see but that white-hot fire, until at last another pinpoint of light appears in the distance, above and beyond them, like a single star in a black sky. It's the light at the end of the tunnel. The fireman checks his watch, and they're bang on time. But what would the Severn Tunnel have been like in steam days, when someone had to be tail-end Charlie on a banking engine?
Not very pleasant, I should imagine. I've never done it, but you could imagine being on the rear of about 50 wagons with one of these on the front. They were glad to get out the other side, I think. We're now approaching Patchway Tunnel. This is on quite a heavy gradient up here. It's a single bore tunnel as well.
Like so many single bore tunnels, Patchway was disliked by enginemen. The tube of brickwork encases the engine to such an extent that fumes have nowhere else to go but the crew's lungs. Hugh Button looks around at brickwork that's close enough to touch. And then, as before, the first daylight in the distance. Another blinding dawn in the underworld.
Single flashing yellow indicating to us that we were going to be diverted to the right at Patchway Junction ahead.
And before you know it, they're at Temple Mead Station, strolling to a standstill with a sigh of steam and a squeal of steel. So far, so good.
Anywhere you like, Grant.
In the mid-morning sunshine, another team takes over, including Bob Robson, who's been polishing King Edward I for 10 years. The engine will spend much of the summer at the Barton Hill Locomotive Depot, where support crews from the 6024 Preservation Society will carry out most of the cleaning and maintenance work. Weekly mainline trips make it hard to keep the locomotive as clean as Bob Robson would like. And inevitably, it's the hidden bits that get neglected when time is short.
I've always said if we can get it done 3 times a year, but that's completely gone now. It's once a year if we're laid up anywhere for maintenance. But the maintenance work we done last year with the tour, I think we done 10 Torbay straight off, and you just cannot keep up with the work underneath. And as long as they say like the run tomorrow, we're doing the main things what the public see: the running plate, the rods, the buffers, the front, and the smoke box. And hopefully we'll get by. Lucky we've been lucky with the weather. It's been dry, so the end is not too dirty.
Any mention of the weather during a British summer is tempting fate, of course, and sure enough, as King Edward I emerges from Bristol the following day, the sun has disappeared. This is to be a familiar pattern during summer Sundays in 2008, and by the time she reaches Dawlish, the brollies are coming out, and there's hardly anyone on the beach. This will be remembered as the summer that never really happened. But there's some good news to temper the gloom. Stops at Taunton and Exeter have confirmed that the bearings are still cool. And King Edward I is going like a train as she heads up the estuary towards Newton Abbot. She's an escapee from a world where Tiger Moths and Austin Sevens were state of the art.
Well, it's difficult to find a parallel in terms of engineering where we've got here an 80-year-old, in effect, piece of kit based on design principles established 100 years ago and to technology 150 years ago. So in the automotive field or the aviation field, there isn't a parallel. I guess in shipping you might find it, but actually what we're doing is running this bit of kit in a modern context on a very high pressure railway, lots of intensity, and yet somehow or another we're able to do it. It's remarkable, really.
Equally remarkable is 6024's destination. The estuary of the River Dart, one of Britain's finest harbours, is a place where steam still reigns supreme. The Paignton and Kingswear Railway is the only standard gauge steam railway still run purely as a business, without the help of volunteers. In fact, the whole area has a feeling of yesteryear about it. It's full of boats that might be as old as the King. Many of the boat building and the fishing trades survive, and people are still getting around the way young Nelson used to. The real outsider here is the motor car, ferried uncomfortably across to Dartmouth. No wonder many people prefer to let the train take the strain. And a tank engine built to haul coal trains in South Wales finds itself living in splendid retirement at the head of the Devon Bell as it drifts past Goodrington Sands. But this is no easy line to conquer, as the King is about to find out. "6024 loses its feet on the steep climb through the cliffs. Is 11 coaches one too many? This is a heavy load for a king and would have been considered so even in steam days when 10 coaches was the usual limit. The week before, when Tangmere was on the Torbay Express, there'd only been 10 coaches, and even so, a diesel had been attached to the end of the train at Paignton. Well might she toot cheerfully with the insurance of a diesel locomotive giving her a good shove up the rear. A few years ago, 9 coaches was considered the maximum sensible load for steam-hauled Torbay Expresses. This is Bradley Manor, leaving Temple Meads with steam to spare. The 2-cylinder GWR 460s were always good pluggers on the banks, but in the same summer, the Castle-class engine Earl Bathurst found 9 coaches quite enough for a 4-cylinder engine as she laboured through Tor Station on the stiff climb from Torquay on the way home to Bristol at the head of the same train. So 11 for a king is hard work. 6024 recovers her composure after slipping twice on the bends and strides away towards the top of the summit, which is a place called Churston. Her owners say a slip or two is only to be expected.
Oh yes, yes, yes. And I think kings in the olden days were limited to about 385 tons over there, which in terms of modern stock would be 10 coaches. Well, we had 11 today, and it copes with that okay. You've got to remember that these weight limits were based on the load that any member of the class could take in any condition and be able to restart. Well, this loco's pretty fit at the moment, so we wouldn't have any problems about slipping to a stand and restarting there. We wouldn't want to do it, far from ideal, but she would restart on that bank.
The last part of the climb is across the type of high viaduct so typical of Devon and Cornwall. You can see the orange heartbeat of King Edward I's fire as she plods across in her normal, sure-footed way. But observers at the line side are wondering what would happen if a summer shower left the rails greasy. And they'll have their answer the very next week. Seven days later, and here she comes across the Somerset levels. The Bristol line crosses at Cogload Junction to join the direct line from Paddington, snaking in from the left, and that would have been where 6024 would have appeared from in days gone by, working trains like the Cornish Riviera Express from London to Plymouth. She'll be in Taunton in another 5 minutes, but years ago, non-stop, they would have been preparing for the climb to Whiteball, her crew getting tired, her fire a little the worse for wear.
Whiteball Tunnel is an interesting one because you approach it from Taunton up Wellington Bank, which is the famous racing stretch in the other direction. But it's 140, 145 miles out of London. Often through expresses to the West Country wouldn't stop at Taunton. So the crew would be beginning to notice that the engine was possibly struggling for steam. They were feeling slightly second-hand. And there's an 11-mile climb which culminates in 2 miles, I think of one in 90 or something before the tunnel. So it wasn't an easy bank to have to achieve in those days. And remember, the turn from Paignton to Plymouth was longer than any other turn in the country. London Crewe, London Grantham, London York, all of those, there would have been a relief, whereas a London Plymouth often was non-stop, and the crew had minimum of 4 hours on the footplate, sometimes 5, sometimes 6. So Wellington Bank and Whiteball Tunnel were pretty tough on the crews at that stage. And more often than not, the locomotive would need the boiler mortgaging for water in order to maintain steam pressure up that bank. Churchward said, I believe, that the last 25 psi on any of his locomotives was the bit that made the difference. This one, you can get by at 180 psi on a bank like Wellington Bank up to Whiteball Tunnel. You can get by, put 13 coaches on the back rather than the 11 we had today, and it would have been a bit of a puff, but she will get by with this sort of load. And so, as I said earlier, it is a very forgiving piece of kit. You can, however, get into trouble if you get it wrong.
One man who understands the King very well is the mainline driver and EWS traction inspector, Tom Rees.
She's a big engine, she's got a big boiler, she likes lots of water. Once you let that water come down a little bit and the clock starts to come back, the steam clock, you're going to lose it. And if you lose it, you've got a job to get it back. You really got to work really hard. She's a hard-working engine. But if you can work at it right, we'll have a good start from you, because we put the fire right before we come into Exeter.
With Tom at the controls, Keith Lyons provides a running commentary.
Just pulling away from Exeter, 11:58 on time departure. Driver's just opening the regulator into first valve. Slowly pulling away, picking up the weight of the train. Full boiler pressure, 250 pounds. Hear the engine blowing off. Disposing of steam for the safety valve. Which is just excess steam now. Because the boiler's limited to 250 pounds, the safety valve lifts so the boiler doesn't accumulate pressure over her permissible limit. The firebox nice and full, just nicely burning through, and hopefully for a good run down non-stop down to Paignton. Driver's just eased off there and showing onto the valve up here, the jockey valve up here, showing that he's getting oil on his gauge here, showing that although he's got no actual much steam on, he's getting oil to his pistons and valves. local church, people were waving.
Did you get a very good response from people?
Oh, fantastic. Everybody waves to a steam engine. Where they just let the diesels go by, everybody waves. We're clear now. The driver's now altering what we call the regulator down in front of the driver, which acts as a gearbox on a steam locomotive and increases or decreases the amount of time the steam has to get to the cylinders. Now the fire has started to burn through, Fred the fireman is starting to refire and build his fire back up again. The firebox itself is actually 11'6" long and takes quite an amount of work and technique from the fireman to reach the front of the firebox.
On the footplate, your eyes are everywhere. Eyes, nose, ears. That's what it's all about on the footplate. And we're all the same. And nobody misses a trick. If I miss something, somebody else will pick it up. So nobody misses a trick. The main concern of all of us is the safe running of the train. It's as simple as that. To make sure that train will get there safely.
Why do you say eyes, nose and ears and not... I'm not a railwayman, I don't understand.
Well, you listen for things and you smell things like hot boxes and different things like that. You can smell them, you know, before you hear them you can smell them. But other sounds, unusual sounds, which you don't hear, you know, like a blow in the firebox or something like that, you know, it's all unusual. I mean, when the engine's going lovely, it's great. But as soon as something is out of beat or there's something wrong, you pick it up straight away.
By the time they reach the estuary of the River Exe, the summer has done its usual trick. Gone is the blue sky, and now there's rain in the air. Ahead of them is an unexpected signal stop at Torquay.
Look at this. Come with the rail. Just for the punters.
There's good-natured mickey-taking about the stormy departure, but all of them know it's in the lap of the gods as to whether a steam locomotive will start cleanly, and they never stop learning.
You learn something on the railway every day. One of the guys said to me, when you come on the railway, you don't come on the railway as a job, you marry the railway. It's a marriage, and you marry the railway. You're either a railwayman when you come on, and right away through, or you're not. So you marry the railway. and that's what we do. We just reel. I mean, just reel, a railing man, full stop, and that's it, through and through.
At Paignton, the new crew takes over, aware that the manor on the train ahead of them is struggling slightly for adhesion as a fine mist of rain makes the rails slippery. Goodrington Bank is ahead and the King has 11 on again. The professional enginemen of the Paignton and Kingswear Railway do this job every day, so watch how skillfully the driver pumps the regulator, controlling the amount of steam allowed into the cylinders while reducing all the time the valve travel. And he listens carefully to the engine. By the time he gets to Goodrington Bank, he'll have set the engine for the climb, avoiding any temptation to fiddle about with the controls, though he will be using the sanders for sure. If it's wet on the bank, this climb will be near the King's legendary limits for sure-footedness. They're in luck, leaving the bad weather behind them as they climb into the sunshine on a dry track. The gleam of sunlight on the pressure gauge means a sporting chance of avoiding further rainfall on this trip. Watching an 80-year-old machine storming up the bank, you realise how ruggedly these things were built back in the 1920s.
by modern standards, these things are hopelessly over-designed. Everything's twice as big or 10 times as big as it need be. But then they were expected to do 50, 60,000 miles a year without anybody batting an eyelid. And of course, that's what these did for 30 years, 32 years.
But could the design of the King have been developed further?
The chain has a weakest link, and you stiffen something up, strengthen something, make something perform better, do something in order to make more horsepower come out of it or whatever, and something else will give. That is the nature of it, and that is why these machines ultimately turned out in the way that they were. In order that in normal use they just kept going. Now, if we were, for instance, to streamline the steam passages, as was often discussed as a potential, something would give. The frames would be not strong enough, or something else would go. It's reached the optimum. We get more horsepower out of it than ever was expected to be got out of it in service in steam days. It's pushed harder these days than ever it was, simply in order to keep schedules, frankly.
Having passed the summit, the driver's hand now rests on the combined brake lever. Most steam locomotives working on the main line have some sort of combination of steam, air and vacuum braking, and the King will need all her brake power to bring the heavy train, with a combined weight of about 500 tons, smoothly into Kingswear station, on the quayside far below. Now the fire has been allowed to die down, but provides welcome light in the short tunnel that cuts through the hillside above the River Dart. It's only when you look back over your shoulder that you remember the length of the train, and also the size of an engine driver's responsibility. His mind will be half a mile ahead and focused on the point where the heavy train will be brought gently to rest. With just a whiff of steam to propel her into the platform, King Edward I reaches her destination. One final tap on the brake handle, and it's a job well done. Many of the passengers on their pastime rail day out will ride across the Dart on one of the frequent ferries, or just watch other people playing about on the river. The King, meanwhile, has travelled light engine back up the hill to Churston for turning. This is where the branch to Brixham veered off in steam days, and nowadays is a convenient spot for a turntable. The railway is determined to be a good neighbour, and it's remarkable how quietly the King is handled as she trundles onto the turntable, stopping just at the right place. The locomotive is carrying a temporary headboard to thank one of the railway's staff for years of support on the occasion of his retirement. The engine is slowly turned by hand. Golfers on the green just 100 yards away don't even know that royalty has come calling, and before they know it, King Edward I is already tiptoeing out of Churston, ready for the evening's return trip to Bristol. There's thunder in the air, as well as church bells, but hopefully the engine will outrun any further bad weather on the way home. Many people believe that this route is one of Britain's great railway journeys.
It's the classic holiday route to the west. It's the one that everybody romanticized about when they were little, and the one that people enjoyed when they came down on a summer Saturday from any part of the country. There's the traditional western banks, of course. Then there's this wonderful sweep along the Teign estuary before we reach the seawall, which hopefully the sea is out there calm and blue with people in their trunks and all the rest of it. And then Exeter, fine city, then the climb up to Whiteball the other side, which again is a classic bit of King work. 20 miles of climb. And then the Somerset levels later on, 40 odd miles, 45 miles, dead flat. So it encapsulates everything that makes a steam locomotive interesting, quite honestly.
The railway pierces the red Devon sandstone near Dawlish in a series of 5 tunnels. This is a view from the buffer beam, a view no steam traveller ever had. She reaches the station at Dawlish, where, in a previous world, generations of children deserted their sandcastles to see the trains or climb the small footbridge to watch the engines passing. And a couple of miles further away, just as the small harbour of Cockwood is falling into its Sunday evening reverie, a distant sound like the cry of a gull will herald the passage of a king. Tim Watson believes it's just a pragmatic fact of life that kings and castles were the perfect express engines for this part of the world.
Swindon, Doncaster, Crewe, Eastleigh, they all did what they had to do for their own patch. There was no messing around. They just produced machines that suited what they had to do in terms of hauling traffic and operating. It was a purely commercial instinct to do that, and the Kings built at Swindon were built for this route and the route to Plymouth principally. And their design characteristics very, very intimately reflect the work that they were required to do, which is why on this route this locomotive is probably the most suited to do the work. And likewise, you go around the country and nobody would argue that a Duchess isn't the right locomotive for the West Coast Main Line, for instance. That's just the way it is. And the gradients and such on this route are particularly severe, and a 4.6 naught with the power of a king is the most appropriate locomotive.
Duchesses performed no better than kings in the west of England, but the king is itself outclassed when visiting the Scottish borders, and there's a simple reason.
Western routes almost always have short, sharp climbs at the top. You might have a long drag like Wellington Bank or up to Whitehall from Exeter, but the last 2 miles, the last 3 miles are the tricky ones, and it was always the intention to use steam for very high levels for very short periods in order to achieve those climbs. And the combination of a large boiler and a front end which would use all the steam that you could generate for short periods was combined with a relatively small grate, as you mentioned, because that was what was needed. If you do 15 miles at 1 in 100, such as the Settle and Carlisle, you're going to need a different kind of machine. And although Royal Scots and Jubilees did very well on those routes, they didn't take huge loads. Likewise, a Duchess, wide firebox, best suited for the sort of work that it has to do. It's the horses and courses thing.
And yet, in fairness to the king, you were on the footplate on the long drag, Tim. She had a big load behind the tender that day.
Yes, we're hopelessly overloaded, 520 tons, 13 coaches, flogging up at 35 miles an hour for 25 minutes or whatever it was, just keeping going with the water level gradually dropping. Quite scary really, but she just keeps going. You won't break records with the King on the Settle and Carlisle with that sort of load. Put 11 coaches on and she'd do better. But commercial pressures mean that you've got to take a full payload. She did all right. She wasn't that good. If ever she went again, we would try and get a better load and see how we would do.
The King storms away from Exeter on the long climb over the Blackdown Hills, with Traction Inspector Tom Rees on board. Many people would consider him a lucky man. Theirs is a one-off, a special day out that will never be forgotten. But his next trip is never far away.
That's next Sunday on the King again. Yes, I always look forward, yeah. I'm going to buy a vicar's collar because I only work on a Sunday.
August turned into September, and the King was going better than ever. Loco owners often remark on how well an engine goes when she's being regularly thrashed. There was, though, that niggling worry about the slightly warm bearing on the front bogie. Tangmere was reported short of steam on some of her trips, and Nunney Castle never turned up at all, leaving the King to do the bulk of the work as the days got shorter, meaning an arrival back at Bristol in darkness. And then, just as it seemed that things were going well, it was on an arrival like this one at Taunton that the King's Achilles heel let her down. It should have been a simple water stop, but this was as far as the King was to go, stranded with that dreaded hot box. In steam days, another loco would have been rustled up at Taunton Shed, but the modern Torbay Express went forward diesel-hauled, and the King limped to the sanctuary of the West Somerset Railway for some surgery. Keith Lines explains the fragile nature of that critical film of oil upon which a steam locomotive rides.
This is the front leading axle box on the bogie. That's the box which is allowed to slide up and down in the horn, which takes your springing and gives you your suspension. Inside there is a bearing through there and an axle through there. The axle obviously runs in the bearing. Underneath the axle, in here, which we call the oil keep, there is a big felt pad that wipes the axle. That picks up oil and takes it underneath the bearing and the axle to a point where actually the engine rides on a thin film of oil on all the axles, because oil has to be between the bearing and the axle face, otherwise you'd run, as we mentioned earlier, the hot box.
But it had been a good season. The King had performed powerfully. The King still ruled the West. Long live the King.